Hi, my name is Stephen Emick. I am an honorably retired member of Lehigh Presbytery, having served as a pastor at First Presbyterian Church in Allentown before my retirement. I also am a child of Lackawanna Presbytery, having grown up and been under the care of the Hickory Street Presbyterian Church and Lackawanna Presbytery quite a few years ago now. Thank you for joining me for this presentation on congregational care and vitality. Before we begin, though, I want to make sure that you have copies of the handout that you will need to get the most out of this presentation. Let me show you where you can get them. It's on the Presbytery website. And so what you need to do is if you go to the Presbytery website, lehighpresbytery.org, and then look on the top right where it says resources, click on resources, scroll down when you get on the resource page until you see church resources, and then click on church resources. That's going to take you to this screen. You're going to scroll down again, look for Congregational Care and Vitality Part 1. You have two options. If you click that eyeball, it will let you view the document on your screen, or if you click the download button, it will download the document. You then can print it out. It is 4 pages, and it has information that will reinforce some of the things we're about to talk about, and some other things for you to have more conversation around. And that is what the document looks like. So, let me say a word about this presentation. I was going to present this at the February Assembly of Lackawanna and Lehigh Presbyteries, but when the schedule changed, I was unable to be there. And so I have offered to record this because I think it's an important conversation that we all need to have. Having said that, I am willing to make an offer that if any churches, sessions would like for me to engage your group in a conversation with this presentation, I certainly am more than willing to do that. So this was part one of a year-long focus that both of our moderators, Don Brown in Lehigh Presbytery, Bill Carter in Lackawanna Presbytery, have committed to focusing on the congregational care and vitality of the churches within our presbytery. I was asked to present part one, churches under 20 members. So I want to share with you why me and why now? Why this conversation? I have been a part of 2 administrative commissions in Lehigh Presbytery, one a year ago that was formed to close the Mahanoy City Presbyterian Church. And I'm currently serving as a moderator of the administrative commission that is working with the Freeland Presbyterian Church. My background is not in small churches, but in retirement, I'm spending a lot of time in these roles and also moderating several sessions of these small churches. As we're about to enter into this conversation, I want to say this. I want us to speak the truth in love. Some of what I'm about to say could be heard in different ways. It might be heard as anything less than supportive. I don't mean it to be that way. But I think it's time for us all to speak the truth in love as we consider the future of the Church of Jesus Christ, particularly in and through Lehigh and Lackawanna Presbyteries. So in those 2 experiences that I have had with the administrative commissions, there were a lot of similarities, and yet they also were 2 very different experiences. The similarities, both were in small towns, Weatherly and Freeland. The community's little prospect for growth for the community as well as the congregations. Both congregations, like many of our churches, were aging as well as the communities. They are no longer able to secure the officers and the leadership from within the congregation that are basic necessities of Presbyterian polity. And I believe that what happened in both these cases is that the people, the members that were there, are the last ones standing, and they're faced with the decision that nobody wants to accept. And that is a possibility of closing a church. Now, there were some significant differences. One was that one of the administrative commissions working with the one church was willing to face the reality that even though it wasn't what they wanted, they turned to the presbytery and said, it's time for us to close. please partner with us and walk us through that process. Closing a church is an act of the presbytery, and so presbytery is responsible. However, the other church that our administrative commission has been working with, they know that their days are numbered, but they really would prefer to hang on until either the money runs out or their members are all gone. But the dilemma is they can't honor our Presbyterian polity and requirements of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania as a corporation to provide the officers. They do not have a minimum of 3 people willing and able to serve as officers and members of the session. So my takeaways from these 2 experiences that I've had are that no 2 churches are the same. And we need to keep that in mind as we have this conversation, that this is hard work. Nobody wants to see it happen. No one wants to face the possibility of closing a church. I also want us to remember that these are real people. They're children of God. They're not just numbers on some roster whose lives are impacted by these decisions. And in all likelihood, the reality is that if and when a church closes, even though we work to transfer those membership to a different church, the reality is most of them won't become active in the life of another church. And the other takeaway is this reality is not going away. Let me give you some background on that. Here is a chart that shows the membership in our presbyteries. It's also on the handout. You will see 2 categories under Lackawanna and Lehigh. One is our current list of congregations, and the other is 10 years ago. Far right will give you a total. So if you look at that, 10 years ago, between our 2 presbyteries, we had 82 churches. We currently have 68. 10 years ago, we had over 14,000 members. Today, just a little over 7,000 members. And maybe equally important is look at where the distribution is in terms of sizes. 10 years ago, between our 2 presbyteries, we had one over 2,000 members. We had one that was over 1,500 members. We no longer have churches that large. We have one that is over 1,000. But look at where the others are in that far right column. They continue to shrink in size. One of the things that I think we have a hard time remembering is that it's not just the church that is having issues and that is wrestling with its future. In the past 10 years, the 14 counties that make up both of our presbyteries, here's a quiz for you. What was the fastest growing racial ethnic group in those 14 counties over the past 10 years? Do you want to guess? Hispanic Latino. What is the fastest growing age group in those 14 counties over the past 10 years? Guess? 65 years and older. And what age group had the largest decline in our communities over the last 10 years? 35 to 49-year-olds. However, there was an exception in Monroe, Pike, and Sullivan counties where the largest decline was in 5 through 19-year-olds. The reality that this shows us is that the communities in which many of us find ourselves are changing drastically. And the question becomes, in what way have our congregations changed in light of those changes? And if we've not, is there a way that we can? So let me say a little bit more a word about what you're about to see and why it is that I'm doing this. So after having worked with 2 administrative commissions and feeling for these small congregations, and particularly realizing that these congregations, as much as they want to continue, can't honor our polity, I've wondered, is there some other way for them to be church? So I went to the Facebook group, PCUSA Leaders, and I posted an invitation across the country and said that I wanted to host a Zoom conversation about ways to care for churches that have less than 20 members. Immediately, there was tremendous response. Over 300 people responded to that post. 42 people registered to participate in the conversation. The day of the conversation, 20 actually participated. I posed 3 questions to this group. Question 1, brainstorm and share ways for presbyteries to support congregations with less than 20 members who no longer can honor the basic polity requirements to be a Presbyterian church but desire to gather for worship. What might we come up with as ways to do that that would honor their desire to continue to worship and be congregations, but also acknowledge that there are some polity issues? Question number 2, discuss if and when it's appropriate for a presbytery to step in pastorally and initiate the closure of a church that cannot or will not make that decision for themselves. Question number 3, what can we learn from churches in this situation to help other churches who appear to be headed in the same direction? So I want to say at this point that if you find yourself saying, well, that's not the church I attend, that's not the church that I'm a part of, we have more than 20 members, I believe that there are things for us to learn from these churches that we need to be talking about in all size congregations, not just those under 20. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to share responses, some of the responses to each of these questions. I've gone through the video recording of the Zoom meeting, and I've pulled several for each of the 3 that give us a breadth of the conversation that was going on. I invite you to listen to these people's responses. And then when the responses to the first question are done, I'm going to invite you to have a conversation. I would love to engage in that conversation with you. But instead, what I'll do is I will stop the video or ask you to stop this video, have the conversation for maybe 5-10 minutes, and then continue and go on to the next one. It'll make sense as we move along. So let's remember, question number 1, brainstorm and share ways for presbyteries to support congregations with less than 20 members who no longer can honor the basic polity requirements to be a Presbyterian church but desire to gather for worship. Here are some thoughts.
If anybody hasn't seen it yet, Overture 5 that came from the Santa Fe Presbytery, which is amazing, Bobby. It talks about providing basically a council, like a session at the presbytery level for these churches that are so small and tired that they don't want to do it anymore.
No.
And so honestly, we've got a couple churches in Scioto Valley that if they didn't have to have the required 4 meetings a year and, you know, the congregational meeting once a year, they would be a lot happier. And they could, you know, continue to exist until the money runs out in their account. So I would encourage everybody to look at Overture 5 and see if you want to concur on that. Maybe we can actually get somebody to pay attention to how we could be helpful to our small churches. But also, you know, helping to set up parish models is also a valid way to work. We have both ministers and mission pastors that are taking on multiple churches in one geographic area. And that way we can provide some pastoral care as well as the polity leadership for multiple churches without having to have the funds to provide for a pastor for a church or even 2 churches. But within a group of 5, we might be able to have a minister and a lay pastor to meet the needs of what they're looking for. They may not have worship every week. They might have to take 1 week off every month, but it's working.
We have a parish that's actually got a lot of history to it. Its current iteration has probably been going on for 7 or maybe 8 years. But it is a 4-church parish who uses some supplemental CPs and or folks that have been through that commission pastor training but aren't serving anywhere to do some of the preaching. The pastor only preaches twice and they kind of have a rotational model. It is working. I will tell you that you just have to have a lot of buy-in from those 4 churches. It's working because they're committed to it. I can give you plenty of examples from other independent-minded Appalachian folk who have no interest in that. But that is, if you can sell it, it can work well. So yeah.
Well, first, let me tell you that I grew up in a church that size. 15 was a big crowd. And that's the size congregation that raised me and taught me how to be a pastor. And then I went to seminary in the 80s. And since 1990, I've been pastoring the same small congregation in North Carolina, another wonderful, healthy little congregation. My presbytery work right now is with church development and evangelism. And we are talking about this very question and beginning to partner with our committee on ministry, collaborate on this. Because we have many small churches, especially down East North Carolina, that we cannot get clergy to go to. And so we're going to have to get creative and find ways to support what I think of as old worshiping community. And I think worship is a worthy goal. Getting people together for Bible study and worship is a worthy goal because it does and can help reach people for Jesus.
I had 5 churches in Southwest Oklahoma for about 8 or 9 years, and they were covenanted to be a parish. And so we had each of them had their own sessions, God bless them, and each of them, but then we had a kind of a super session, there was no word for it, where the parish people got together and decided what's good for the parish. And one of the better things we did was to gather the numbers of people in each of those churches and add those up and say, last week in the Southwest Oklahoma Presbyterian Parish, way too long a name, that, there were 78 people worshiping.
Wow.
Now, there may have been 5 at one church and, 20 at another, but, it gave them a sense of hope and community, that was good. One of the tricks was trying to pay someone to be like the person over that. But, they kind of did it on a percentage method of this church has X number of dollars in the bank and this church doesn't. But, there is a possibility of doing that kind of work.
So here's what I'd like you to do. I want you to turn with the people that you're with. Hopefully you've got some watching along with you. And I want you to share a takeaway from the video responses you just saw to that first question. Okay? And stop the video and share your thoughts, responses. And when you're ready to move on, start the video and I'll be here waiting. Here was question number 2 that I posed to this group. Discuss if and when it is appropriate for a presbytery to step in pastorally and initiate the closure of a church that cannot or will not make that decision for themselves. Let's listen in.
I would just looked up a conversation that we had in my previous presbytery, and that is that even in small churches where folks are just showing up for worship and that's pretty much all they do, there are leaders in that church who are still making things happen, right? They're still making sure the grass gets cut. They are still making sure that the boiler gets fixed. They are still, and what happened was the current small session really just had to speak the truth to the rest of the congregation that they were tired and they couldn't carry this load anymore. And then it became a conversation, not about the presbytery coming in and making a decision about whether to close or to push a congregation to close. Then it's about how do we love each other well? What is it fair to ask other people to do for us so that we can keep the doors open? And when is it the loving thing to say, we're not going to expect you to do this anymore. We're going to set you free. We're going to unbind you. And so that was just a way to frame the conversation that led to a better outcome, I think, than presbytery coming in and doing anything. And then presbytery became the facilitator of the truth telling, not the, you know, the entity coming in to make the decision.
If to jump in, one of our issues is that we, you know, despite every effort of COM trying to send out liaisons, making phone calls, sending letters, we have many small congregations who simply disappear from the presbytery's radar. And by the time they call us, or very often it's not even that someone calls us, somebody in the congregation will say, you should probably come out and check what's going on out here. We have a building that has fallen into disrepair. We have no functioning session. We have, you know, very often they have been calling in the pulpit supply that is way off of the Reformed farm. And what always breaks my heart is, you know, if we could have gotten in there 5 years earlier, or, you know, just to, and not necessarily that the outcome would have been much different, but, you know, what I'm always saying is, how can we help them land the plane? How can we help churches close and talk about legacy and talk about seeds for ministry? You know, the other frustration we have is that, you know, that whole notion of we're just going to stay here until the money runs out. You know, that is like a terrible way to go. The first church that I pastored actually dissolved about 2 years ago, and they recognized their limitations. They still had a little money left. They were able to sell their buildings, make big, fat contributions to missions that they care about. And one of the things I'm trying to do in our presbytery is that we have churches who have closed really, really well. It hurt, it was hard, it's not the outcome they would have chosen, but at the end of it, they can say, we were faithful, God was faithful, here's how we stuck together and did this work. Here's how we continued our worshiping life together. And sometimes I think churches just need to hear a good, you know, that somebody had a good death. Not only that a good death is possible, but because we are people of the resurrection, you know, death is not the end of the story for any congregation. And I'm just going to say one more thing, and then I'm going to shut up.
Thank you.
I have seen 5-member churches do incredible mission and ministry. I have seen 500-member churches not being able to do a thing for God's kingdom. But we get hung up on size. And for me, the question is God still at work here? Is God still speaking to these people? Can we help them? Or does it have to be in this building? Because very often that's what is killing our congregation. It's not, if they're spending all their time mowing grass and fixing windows and repairing the roof, and all of their money and energy is going into that, you know, it's time to have another conversation about, you know, you can stay together, but it may not be in this place.
Right, at least in New Covenant, we ask, you know, if a fellowship or if New Worshiping Community wants to charter, they need to have at least 100 people sign that petition. But we allow our churches of 20 and 15 and whatever to continue as a church. So I don't understand why we ask for 100 in the beginning and then allow the dwindling.
So take a few minutes again, and this time share a takeaway from those video responses to question number 2. The questions are listed for you on the handout that hopefully you have in front of you so that you can refer to that. Take a few minutes, and then I'll be here waiting. Before we move on to the third question, I want to say a word about something that you're going to hear in at least one of the video responses. And it is an initiative called Project Regeneration. It is an initiative of the Presbyterian Foundation where they will work with the congregation to help you discern what next steps, what your future might be as a congregation. It has been met with a lot of appreciation and has been extremely helpful around the country. On that handout that you have, I have the link listed where you can get more information about Project Regeneration and how to be in touch with someone from the Presbyterian Foundation if your congregation would be interested in participating. So keep that in mind. You're going to hear more about that. So here's the third question, and this is why I think this conversation is important for all of us, regardless of what size congregation we're a part of. What can we learn from churches that are in this situation? Less than 20 members, having a hard time honoring the polity to continue to be a Presbyterian congregation. What can we learn from their situation to help other churches who appear to be headed in that direction? Maybe not today, tomorrow, maybe 10, 20, 30 years from now. But the reality is, at the moment, that appears to be where many of our congregations are headed. Listen to these thoughts.
Ron triggers me to say that part of the when and if question to me goes backwards to the extent to which the secretary has a relationship with the church. I think our experience in conversation has been the need for the presbytery to nurture better relationships with the church. So the success of the when and if, I think, depends on what the quality of that relationship is.
There used to be a day when the presbytery understood, and most people understood, the presbytery was responsible for where its churches were located and the ministry that they had. And somewhere along the line, there are many times when I thought the presbytery ought to be having active conversations with its congregations about moving them to where, they would have more effective ministries, and for all kinds of reasons. But we rarely have engaged in those conversations in the same way that we don't want to go into small churches and offend them and have people be mad and the presbytery be the bad guy. But at some point, the presbytery too, I think, stopped living out its ministry and its calling. So, and now all these years later, we've sowed those seeds and now we're living with it. But so I think it works both ways, and I don't know what the best way, but there are important pieces of ministry, I think, that we ought to be ministry and mission that we ought to be considered that we haven't defined very well in bylaws and so forth.
I wonder what happens when our yardstick becomes a conversation of abundance rather than a conversation of scarcity when we work with small churches. I just wonder if we start moving from abundance rather than scarcity. So how do we get away from numbers and look at the actual spirit of God in that place?
Yeah, and just two really quick things. One, the Long Island Presbytery had an opportunity to bring in Paul from Project Regeneration, and we found the material was excellent. But if you have an opportunity to engage congregations under your care in that process, really be clear on the outset of what it's for and what the purpose is. Because a lot of our congregations came thinking they were going to get a magic bullet to solve all their problems and got really frustrated when that's not what it was. And then just a second thing, just a food for thought. What I'm realizing is a lot of us are either volunteers or employed by presbyteries, and a lot of this work is falling on presbyteries. And I have a larger arching concern that as congregations close within our boundaries and they get smaller and they lose that energy, so does our volunteer pool as presbytery folks. And I wonder if there's a secondary conversation about how we can maintain vitality in our presbyteries when we're losing pastors and elders and congregations to both fund the ministry of our presbyteries and larger bodies, but also provide the volunteers that are going to serve in those ministries as well. So just a food for thought.
A lot of food for thought. So again, take a few moments, share with those around you. What is a takeaway from the responses to question number 3? You've got the question on your handout. Stop this recording for right now. And when you're ready, come on back and we'll wrap things up. So what? What's the big deal? What do we need to do in light of what we've just heard and talked about? Certainly no one conversation or presentation covers the bases. This is meant to start a conversation. This is meant especially for me to help encourage all of us to speak the truth in love about our concerns, our joys, and our fears about the future of our congregations and our presbytery. So here are a few things that I think about in terms of the so what. The reality is that the world and the culture have changed all around us at an incredible pace in recent years. So how has your church responded to that change taking place right outside your doors? I remember back in 2007 when I was on the pastoral staff at First Presbyterian Church in Allentown. Our senior pastor had just retired, and we brought a consultant in to help us begin thinking about the next season in the life of that congregation. The consultant came in, took a look at a lot of the demographics of the Lehigh Valley of our church. He met with all the staff one-on-one, and I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, "Stephen, here's the reality. You are a large congregation, First Presbyterian Church of Allentown. You're surrounded by a lot of small churches that are closing." Well, this is back in 2007. And it's easy, he said, for you to think that First Presbyterian Church is immune. He said, but the reality is the world has changed all around you, including the neighborhood right outside the church doors. And based on his study, we hadn't changed in any way in response to those changes. What he said was all of the statistics and all of the data he looked at clearly indicated to him that First Presbyterian Church of Allentown had peaked, plateaued 15 years prior to that. And he said, what you don't understand is you too are dying. A very slow death. It might be 20, 30, 40 years. But unless something happens to turn this ship in a different direction in response to all the changes around you, you too are going to close and die. Something to think about. Another so what? The church's call is always to proclaim the gospel and share God's love with others. So how is your church doing that beyond its walls? Can you be the church without your building or your current location? Death is a part of life, including churches. Does your church live in fear of dying or with hope in the resurrection? The presbytery is us. We're in this together, and we need to speak the truth in love with each other. When was the last time that your church spoke openly and honestly about its future? And finally, what will you do in response to this presentation? I hope and trust that all of what we've heard in this presentation will stir some things within you and the leadership in your congregation to have some conversation around all of this. Know that this is just the first step, that thanks to the commitment of Bill Carter and Don Brown, our moderators, future assemblies of our presbytery throughout 2024 will address some other issues like the vitality of a congregation. Someone from Project Regeneration will come and make a presentation, and there are other special speakers and programs lined up for us. So the conversation will continue. But for now, what will you do in response to all that you have seen and heard? Again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your commitment to the Church of Jesus Christ and your congregation and Lackawanna and Lehigh Presbyteries. May God continue to bless you in this season and in the seasons to come.